Thank you for watching the Housing Oregon YouTube channel. Please like and subscribe. Slide decks from the presenters are going to be available below. Thanks for watching.
But thank you so much for coming. This is the longest title ever, from feasibility to stabilization, how asset managers and developers can collaborate to create operationally resilient, affordable housing properties. So hopefully you're in the right room. Okay, so my name is Kimberly Taylor. I am the Director of Asset Management at Housing Development Center. I'm going to be moderating our panel today and probably talking a little bit and adding some things. I would love to have our panel introduce themselves. Julie Garvey from Home Forward is out, unfortunately, sick. So we have our amazing Melissa Baker, who has joined the panel to add her expertise to the conversation. So I'm going to hand it over for intros. We're going to use this like pack thing and see if it works. Let's see.
All right, testing. Yeah. Okay. Hi, my name is Mary Aileen Langsdorf Hansen. Much like the title, my name is extra long. So you can also, I go by Mel for short. I'm a senior asset manager for Community Development Partners, also called CDP. It's a for-profit certified B corporation, affordable housing developer and owner operator. We have departments for development as well as asset management that we do in-house. So.
Hey, good afternoon. I am Melissa Baker. I am a senior asset manager on the real estate equity team for enterprise community investment. However, I've been tripping around this industry as an owner rep for 20 years. So it's great to be here.
My name is Natalie Thornton. I am the Asset Program Manager for Community Partners for Affordable Housing, also known as SEPA, which is a CDC based here in Portland. We primarily work on the west side in Southwest Portland and Washington County, and pride ourselves on providing high quality affordable housing and robust resident services.
Okay, thank you so much. I think, did you guys hear that okay? That microphone work okay? Awesome. Okay, and I didn't say anything about HDC, so I'll do a little spiel there. So Housing Development Center, for those of you who don't know us, we're a nonprofit consulting group based in Portland. We work primarily in Oregon, a little bit in Southwest Washington. We are development consultants and also asset management consultants. So we provide technical assistance and training on the asset management side, and I lead a team of 3. And so this conversation today is born out of a lot of conversations we have with our clients and also folks who are part of our property and asset management work group. So it's a kind of a hot topic. So there's going to be lots to talk about. Just setting the stage really quick to let you know what we're going to be covering and kind of what the lowdown is. So we've left 20 minutes at the end for questions. We might go over a little bit, but this is a really robust topic and people usually have a lot to say and a lot of questions. So we wanted to leave plenty of time for that if you aren't melting by that time. So we're going to set the table a little bit before we dive into talking about the different development phases. Talking about what asset management used to be and kind of what it is now and how different it is and how much harder it is. Project life cycle and just overview of asset management during development. We're going to then dive into, if you were at the session previous to this in the room next door that was like 50 degrees cooler, so I'm really jealous, was talking about the development phases as like a new owner or board member. So we're going to be kind of pinging off of that conversation. So we'll talk about the development phases of development of affordable housing phases, pre-acquisition, feasibility, pre-dev, and construction, and then lease up and close out, and asset management's involvement in every one of those phases. In conversations that we've heard over the years, it's like asset management gets involved like at lease up. And what we're here to talk about is that asset management needs to be a part of the conversation when a project has like a twinkle in the developer's eye and all the way through. So we'll talk about that. And then, like I said, Q&A for 20 minutes. Okay, so I'm going to spend about 5 minutes talking through these first set of slides, just to kind of, again, set the table. And then we're going to open it up to have our panelists kind of give examples of different ways asset management is involved in the different phases. So I'm going to be annoying and kind of read this slide, but I'll read it with gusto. Okay, so to provide ideas and inspiration on how housing teams can work together to ensure stabilization of projects coming online and future developments are set up for success. Like that's our goal, is to have this conversation, provide ideas and inspiration for you guys to take back to your organizations and have these discussions. How can we bring development, construction, property management, and asset management all together at every stage of a project's development to collaborate and coordinate, to eliminate assumptions and go into a property's operations phase eyes wide open? Okay. So quick question. We're going to ask little questions along the way just to keep you awake. So we want to do a show of hands of who's in the room. So who in the room here, raise your hand, is an asset manager on the owner side? Oh, interesting. Okay. Asset manager for an investor. Okay. Property manager. Ooh, okay. Developer. Yes, love it. Okay. Finance or accounting side of things. Okay, we got a few of those. And any others? Any ones that we didn't name? Shout it out. What do we got? Architect. Nice. Okay. Okay. So part of the development team, which is awesome. Okay, great. It's good to know we have a varied audience. Sometimes it's like mostly asset managers. They're like, we already know this. Okay. So setting the table. So asset management, where it used to be and honestly should be, finance focused, transaction oriented. We're looking at year 15 exit planning for tax credit projects, long-term strategies, 30,000-foot view, cash flow optimization. Where asset management is currently, for a lot of different reasons that we'll probably talk about. Operations heavy and focused, spending more time in the weeds on day-to-day stuff. Granular level of oversight over property management teams. And I didn't see a ton of property management hands. So maybe that's good. I don't know. More oversight equals less deals per asset manager and capacity constraints. And then massive levels of burnout. We're seeing kind of an unprecedented turnover rate in our industry for basically all positions, but a lot of asset management and property management, like staff turnover, just because it's too hard. It's really, really hard. Okay. So essentially this slide, again, a text heavy slide, but this is just so you can take it with you and read it later if you want, or take it to your staff and talk to them about it. So in a lot of ways, an affordable housing asset manager's work is really designed or determined during the project's development. So what a developer puts together is essentially what asset management is going to be responsible for overseeing. So it's really, really important for asset management to weigh in from the very beginning so that we can say, you know what, that's not going to work, whether it's numbers or flooring or any number of things that we're going to get into. Our jobs are designed by what developers are putting together. So think about that when you're putting deals together. So just for a visual, this is our kind of common practice visual slide of what a project lifecycle looks like. You've got a big chunk of development. You've got a little bit of overlap between development and asset management, which is around like 80% construction completion, and then asset management all the way forever and ever. But this is what we recommend is massive integration from the very beginning. And we're going to tell you all about why. So life cycle, this was in the previous slide or the previous presentation. This is what we're talking about. Feasibility, which is like it, and these timelines are going to vary, obviously, depending on the project and location. But we've got feasibility, which is where it's like site identifying and engaging in the project team. Pre-dev is expanding the team and finishing the design piece. permits and construction loan financing. Then you've got construction anywhere from 1 to 2 years, sometimes maybe a little longer, depending. You get the project built and you begin marketing the units, and then lease up and close out anywhere 6 to 12 months. Leasing units transition from construction to long-term financing. So we're going to dive into where asset management fits into every single one of these phases. Okay, our next audience question. Raise your hand if your asset management staff is at the table during discussions regarding acquiring land for a future development or a property for rehab. Yay. I see you, Mary Rain. Nice. Okay, so like 1.5 hands is what I saw. Like a slightly hesitant hand. Okay, good to know. Well, we're going to talk about why it's important to have asset management at the table at this very beginning stage. Okay, so acquisition, pre-acquisition. So again, when you're like, that land, should we build something there? I'm going to hand it over to my colleagues to start talking about it.
Oh, that's okay. Okay. It's okay. We can hear me. Okay. So this phase, as KT mentioned, is the pre-acquisition strategy. So thinking about asset management's involvement in the overall development acquisition strategy. This is something that like CDP from my perspective has put a lot of intentional effort into and is still working on. So we've moved from a relatively informal structure where deals are sourced and then, we kind of find out about it as we head towards closing, if we're lucky. And so we've established an investment committee review process that's made up of folks from leadership from all departments, including accounting and finance, development, as well as asset management. But something to keep in mind is sort of how voting rights for yes or no on a deal goes. So if you're a development heavy organization where you have multiple folks sort of at the table for this investment committee review process, like how does that impact the operations team? How much weight are folks given to discuss potential issues? This is another really good opportunity when you're evaluating a potential deal to discuss maybe some lessons learned from sites that if you haven't done like a total deal post-mortem on something that recently converted or closed, then this is a great opportunity to bring that back into focus and say, hey, I noticed in this deal structure, you have all of these really complicated subsidy layering and none of these regulatory agreements really comply. And what property management company is going to be able to handle 18 different regulations that all cross over each other? So yeah, that's one opportunity to look at.
I think just building on that, this is also a moment in time to ask the question, is this a good fit for our organization, for the communities we are centering and serving? Then also, is this partnership, is this deal structure one that we can effectively manage and oversee for the life cycle of the building, not just a tax credit span of time or just one layer of that stack?
Organizations that are around SEPA size or even smaller, often in the position of having that conversation in response to jurisdictional offerings for development opportunities. So that's an opportunity to initiate this conversation and think about, like you said, Melissa, whether that development opportunity is a good fit for your organization. So say the jurisdiction is really emphasizing ground floor commercial. You can ask yourself and your colleagues, is that something that our organization is well poised to enter into? Is that going to distract us from our mission? Is that something that financially we can handle if we lose the lesser on that space and have 100% vacancy for some period of time? SEPA has probably a portfolio of probably a fifth of the size of CDPs. So we are still in that space of having a pretty informal process around determining whether to move forward with development opportunities. We don't have an investment committee, but as a small or mid-sized organization, there's still a lot of opportunities for asset managers and developers to come together and set some shared goals. So at SEPA, some things that we've talked about are minimizing or eliminating 1-bedroom units at a 60% set aside because they're challenging to lease, especially in the suburban areas where SEPA tends to do its work. Things like fully funding security and resident services expenses in the pro forma for the property.
Yeah, I mean, I think one kind of blanket statement that I want to make is that in affordable housing development, a lot of times we kind of take what we can get, whether it's land or, hey, this donor is giving us a piece of land, like that's perfect. We didn't even buy it. Like, so, but being really thoughtful, I mean, if you take anything away from this session today, is like rope in the people who are going to be managing and overseeing this project for the long term. Because just because it's free doesn't mean that it will be down the line and may end up costing your organization a tremendous amount of money and a lot of stress. So I'll just leave it at that. We also know, another disclaimer, we also know that developers are really under a lot of pressure to put these deals together in whatever way possible. So money from every source you can get your hands on. And we're going to get into this a little bit more when we get into the feasibility phase, which is the next slide. But thinking about how all of these different sources work together. And just don't assume that if you have these 8 sources of funding, that it's going to be easy to manage on the ground. And so we'll talk about that when we get into it. Okay, so our next audience question is: your organization's asset management staff and or property management company consulted when crafting operating projections for a new development? Raise your hand. Okay, that's a little better. That's good. Would love to see more of those. And we're going to talk about why. Okay, let's dive into. I think there's a number of things that we'll probably hit on here. And because we're a little ahead of schedule, I'm going to encourage us to kind of be a little robust in this section because I think it's kind of one of the richest ones where I don't think people realize how much could be avoided in this phase of a lot of the trouble that we see as asset managers down the road. So we'll start off with: our operating projections realistic? Is the project financially viable? And obviously that's the developer's job, right? Is to put all of that together and make it work, It doesn't work like kind of right out of the gate is what we're seeing right now, which I'm sure multiple people in the room can attest to. So we're going to talk about it. I'm going to hand it over.
So fundamentally, data-driven decision-making. So this is the moment in time to take advantage of the folks in your team that are dealing with day-to-day operations today. Because from this moment forward, these operating projections will grow stale. And so the more information and the more input that we can bring from the operating environment is going to ensure that these deals not only function in year 1, but will be poised to function beyond year 15. As KT mentioned, we are seeing operating expense variance unlike any that I've seen in my tenure. And that is not a short-term problem. We're also seeing an intensity of the use of common areas and amenities within our communities that requires us to be much more strategic about what we're putting in the buildings and how we are contemplating the cost of upkeeping those elements.
If if you don't feel like your portfolio is robust enough or has accurate comps for the type of project that you're working on, or your portfolio has a lot of operational outliers or whatever it may be, there are lots of sources for operating data out there. So just one would be Cohn-Resnick's massive study of operating expenses and LIHTC properties that are audited by Cohn-Resnick. That's a free data set that you can download online at your leisure. And just to provide a little snapshot of that data to contextualize why this conversation is so important. In 2022, according to this data set, median cash flow per unit per year for properties in Multnomah County was $50. That's not enough, obviously, to sustain your property over the long term. And of course, that's a median. It's a large data set. Your properties might be performing much better than that. But that's just to provide a metric on which to gauge how serious the situation is in our industry.
I'm going to put a COHNREZNICK.
Nice.
I'm also going to put in a plug. Enterprise has a robust data set as well as an incredible set of tools for every phase of this development timeline as well.
Before Mel jumps in here, I just want to say, for those of you who do not know about HDC's property and asset management work group, we are basically a consortium. HDC facilitates this group. And it's owners from all over the state of Oregon, but we work a lot with funders as well. So we have a lot of that data, and we put a lot of that data together and distribute amongst our members. So come up and find me and grab a card, and we can get you on our list and send you information if you need it.
This is one of my most favorite topics. It's really, it can be really challenging, especially when you're in asset management for an owner and you have internal development as well. There's always that push-pull tension point because you want the deal to go forward, but you also need to be realistic. And so my most controversial suggestion is to talk internally about potentially establishing a deal buffer where projects can operate comfortably despite market-driven challenges. This is getting more and more complicated as time goes on, and we're seeing massive insurance inflation as well as a number of additional operating expenses, as well as seeing the growing need of the tenants we are serving globally speaking. And so understanding what does realistic site staffing look like? Is that 60 units per staff member per function? Is it 75? Is it even less because you have permanent supportive housing layered in? And then as well as understanding the level of services need for the resident population. I think that's been really underrepresented in pro formas, especially historically, is just the value of services and how that position can help really strengthen the property with the right partnership, but also costs money. And so making sure that that is factored into the operating comps as well. And then as Natalie indicated, like sometimes your portfolio may have outliers, and sometimes your portfolio is the outlier for your management company when you're seeking comps. And so also understanding your data set in the context of other housing providers is going to be really valuable, because sometimes folks like to look at data from the management companies, which may not be representative of who you're ultimately going to serve and how your properties are run by those folks. So just another thing to keep in mind.
Do we feel ready to move on to marketability?
Oh, you mean like max run?
Mhm.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm pumped to talk about this. Obviously, we're in a housing crisis, and additional housing units are needed across the income scale. That goes for market rate units as well. And 60% units are obviously easier to fund. They require less capital. And that's not necessarily representative of where the greatest need is. We'd love for all of our projects to be 30% set asides across the board with vouchers on every single unit. And obviously that's not realistic. So it's important to think about the marketability of your project and look at what the trends in the rental market, how they're impacting your portfolio. So for the past couple of years, there's been a softening trend in the rental market, meaning that rental rates are not increasing as rapidly as they once were, and vacancy rates are increasing. And that's very much true for affordable housing as well. And there's a specific challenge around rents on the higher end of the AMI scale, with units that are on the smaller side or in areas with historic disinvestment or just more suburban areas. So for example, 60% rent for a 2-bedroom unit in the Portland metro area for 2024 is right around $1,600. In Tigard, where SEPA has several hundred units, that is right around market rent for an A-ish, B-ish class apartment building. But does your property in development have the same level of marketability as that property? Does it have the same number of amenities? Something that I'm sure a lot of us are encountering are challenges around parking. And I am not one to advocate for the 2-to-1 parking ratios of yore. It's not a great use of land, and it's definitely going to have an impact on the marketability of your property. This is something that SEPA is seeing a lot of in our portfolio. So those are some things to consider. You may not want to pro forma for max rent, depending on the location and the set asides and size of your units.
I think that's actually really common practice for developers to sort of put a deal together with a smattering of 60%, 50%, 30% units and look up your max rent chart and plug in the max rents and be like, there we go. And that doesn't work anymore, you guys. And as Natalie said, your max rent in the Portland area for a 60% unit is many times the same or more than market rate units. And so you just can't assume that your max rents are going to be what you use for a lease up. So we've been, HTCs personally, I've been involved in multiple projects that are going through a lease up, and the performa had max rents with the escalator built in, and they gave those rents to the management company to start marketing the units. And it was like crickets because the rents are too high. Like that's stuff that needs to be, and that sounds really like, who would do that? It's happening all the time because again, your deals have to pencil. So your revenue has to be, I mean, we get it. Like, again, developers are sort of backed into this corner to max out their rents and keep your expenses at X per unit per year. What did our study say? 9,000 per unit per year for, now that's average, and a lot of it's not broken out by property type, but metro area, HTC did a study. The average operating expenses per unit, we didn't break out PSH versus non-PSH, was 9,000 per unit per year. And performers are like, what are they right now? 6,500 or something?
About that.
So like already not working. So if you reduce your revenue and your expenses are going to be way higher, I mean, doing the math, you see what happens. And we're seeing projects not stabilizing. They lease up 100% and then they can't stabilize because the rents are too low, and the expenses are way higher than they planned. So dark times. Okay. So, there's going to be lots of time at the end for us to have more discussion. So I'm going to keep us moving. Write down your questions or comments. Anything else, panel, on this before we move on? Okay. Next audience question. Is your organization's asset management staff, or property management company consulted when determining the lease up schedule for a new development? Whoa, that is not enough hands. Okay, so we're going to talk about why that's important. We're talking about the pre-development phase and asset management input on important deal specifics for massive long-term impact. Okay, handing it over.
So I'll kick us off with the review of agreements. So property management agreements, limited partnership agreements. I want to pause on the LPA specifically because historically there was quite a bit of assumption about the boilerplate language, specifically related to the year 15 exit, that we can no longer count on. And so making sure that not only your development team is taking out, sharp pencil and looking at every line, but that you integrate your asset management team into that process, because regardless of who is in the investor chair in year 15, the asset management team is still going to be on the hook for whatever that agreement says.
One thing that I find so fascinating, because it doesn't make sense to me, is how in previous deals you could get away with not having a lease up reserve set aside or a defined budget ahead of closing. It happens. It just boggles my mind every time. I've heard stories about it. And so understanding like how much does it reasonably cost to run a lease up, running that over with property management, and also comparing it to your lease up and credit delivery schedule to ensure that you have enough funding to hit your benchmarks and probably then some, because things are taking much longer, as we know, both on the construction side as well as on the leasing side. And then something that we have already touched on, but I feel like is an emerging trend for affordable housing is a marketing plan. Something that, again, wasn't necessarily traditional in affordable housing. You build the units and they will come, right? Like that's usually what people say. And that's just not the case anymore, whether it's because of an overwhelming amount of inventory for a certain amount of unit type, and a variety of issues. But establishing a really solid marketing plan before closing, and incorporating costs related to marketing has become a continued trend and something that we've been spending a lot of concerted time and effort on, with some of our marketing team to really understand and digest, especially when you're looking at really like interesting project types. I say interesting. I mean, income averaging is very interesting as a project type. Also can be really challenging depending on the area. And so understanding both proximity to market in terms of market study with your rents, but how are you going to market those when you're competing with probably a market rate environment? And how do you convince somebody to do paperwork for LIHTC units when being potentially underhoused, right? Underhoused, overhoused in a market rate unit would be an easier process for them. So considering all those factors when you're setting up the deal is going to be really helpful for success in the long term.
In addition to thinking about lease up specific expenses with your asset manager, so things like lease up bonuses, third party file reviews, advertising expenses, take a look at your lease up schedule and think about whether operations are going to be self-supporting, and they're not. And you should set aside some money for that in your lease up reserve. And when you're working on your lease up and credit delivery schedule, look at what kind of results your property management company has historically delivered. And again, considering a lot of the factors that we talked about on the last slide around marketability and max rents comparing to market rents, and kind of taking a holistic view. And in the age of construction delays seeming to be a matter of course, think about what you'll do if you're promising to deliver tax credits in year 1 and you have 6 months of construction delays. again, no one up here is under the impression that all the developers in the room are unaware of these issues and challenges. Just pointing out opportunities to work with your asset manager to ensure success.
I think also there are a lot of assumptions made in this process of like thinking about a lease up. Like, oh, 50 units a month. Oh, they could do it. They'll be fine. Wait, that's just what we got to do. Like, we got to hit 100% by X date. So we're just, if we're crunch for time, we're crunch for time. So I think, I mean, development just is dollar signs, right? It's a lot of money. But I think putting more money, again, take away anything from this session, take this away, put aside more money than you think for supporting the lease up process, the marketing, the increased site staff to like get files completed sooner, outreach, gift cards, come sign your lease before the first of the month and get a gift card. Like, it's amazing the things that we see have to happen in order for those deadlines to be met or exceeded. And there's a lot on the line. Like, I think most folks in this room know that if you are ahead of schedule, that actually can translate to dollars. Like, you get that money if you lease up ahead of time. And then conversely, if you don't, you have to pay. So it's worth it to invest the money up front as a reserve, as a second reserve, a third reserve to access to help create a more robust process for leasing and getting residents in the doors. I have a question for the panel, which yep, yeah. Oh, did I go out? Oh, out of battery? Here, okay.
Building on that lease up reserve, a really important discussion, and there's no right answer, but is when and how are you funding reserves for the property, specifically for acquisition rehab deals? There is never going to be enough money to address all the issues that are discovered or more likely not discovered. And so funding a higher level than minimum required upfront really makes it's transformative for the viability of the properties. But again, no right answer, because that is an example where the development team doesn't feel like they have that luxury. So, but it's a really important question to ask and a discussion to have. It sort of goes back to the very where we started, which is how does this fit in to our broader organizational goals and strategy?
My question for the panel, which I didn't ask them ahead of time, so it's a little bit of a cold. I just thought of it. Did your most recent project that leased up, did it, yeah, right? Did it, was the construction on schedule? So that's a no. And did you meet or exceed your lease up schedule? Okay, so I'm just saying, like, I mean, I feel like a bunch of people in the room. I mean, actually, anybody in the room? Did you have a project that finished on time or ahead of schedule? Anybody? Not one hand, everybody. And that's not like calling anybody out, like it's your fault, like things happen. But our point is that asset management has this unique view of being able to kind of see what has our colleagues have experienced, because we talk to each other like a lot. So we kind of know what's going on with everybody else. It's like, oh, that happened. Oh my God. And I think there are also a lot of assumptions around, no shade to property management, but there's a lot of assumptions that property management's got this. Like, they know how to do this. This is what they do. And it's so much more complicated now. And staffing is a really huge problem, like big, big, big problem that I don't think people talk about enough. Not just property management staffing, like portfolio manager, but site staff, compliance staff, maintenance staff, and then asset management staff. So we're supposed to be bringing like ideas and inspiration, and I just feel like we're bringing dark stuff, so sorry. But we're gonna talk when we get to the question part. So any other final comments on this section?
I'd love to touch a little bit more on Melissa's comments about LPA terms.
Yeah.
There are a lot of great resources out there just kind of listing out different sections of the LPA for you and your asset management team to pay attention to. So I won't reiterate all of them. I appreciated Melissa's point about not assuming that interactions or transactions with your investor or syndicator are just going to be easy. I would especially caution against assuming that that's going to be the case with historically friendly nonprofit syndicators, because things change over the course of 15 years and syndicators are working with many investors simultaneously. You could have a proprietary fund or a multi-investor fund involved in your project, and you won't necessarily know the details of that or what the goals are for that fund. So thinking about year 15 exit terms is really important. What the impact on the reserves and whether the property will be able to retain the reserves at year 15. But then also a number of other terms that impact the ongoing operations of the property before then. And I think some of them are listed on the slides here, like your DCR covenants, your cash flow waterfall. SEPA has a property that in, I think, year 8, year 10, maybe started making significant cash flow payments to the investor every year because it's a cash flowing property, and the waterfall, we ran through the waterfall. We paid off the deferred developer fee, and the interest on the sponsor loans was not robust enough to prevent making those cash flow payments to the investor. So ideally, you won't get to that provision after the waterfall that says any remaining cash flow will be distributed according to the partner's interest in the partnership. But if you do, you'll want a plan. So think about negotiating during pre-development with the investor to alter that provision. SEPA's development team successfully did that on a recent project. We will receive a significant chunk of any cash flow that flows all the way through that waterfall.
I mean, bottom line is everything is negotiable, and don't assume that because it's in the draft document that that's what you need to go with. Like, there are just certain points, and there's also different sections, I feel like, that asset management pays more attention to than, say, development staff who are reviewing those kinds of documents. So again, another plug for involving your asset management staff in those document reviews. Okay, we spent a bunch of time on that section, which was really good. We're going to move on. Okay, our next audience question. Is your asset management staff consulted when determining unit specifics for a new development or rehab, like flooring type, kitchen, bathroom finishes, etc.? Not enough hands. Okay. I know there's not a, like, it's a mixed bag of audience members, but yeah, it sounds like a silly question, but we're going to talk about why it isn't. So design and finishes.
In my next lifetime, I'm going to come back as a building science nerd. I love this part. And I know just enough to be really dangerous. So I had the great fortune of working with a team that had both development in-house, but also had a facilities person in-house. And so we managed to really push this space to benefit our upcoming developments. And so what that looked like is that the asset manager and facilities team were invited in as the designs were coming together. The easy place where this shows up is community safety and security. Because if you want 40 cameras at some point in that building's life, you need to have the infrastructure in the walls day one. So even if you only have 5 cameras in your first year projection, it is a fraction of the cost to put in a much more robust system so that the operations team can have flexibility and bring visibility as it's needed over time. Lighting is another place where that shows up in a really significant way. So then as the development continues, this morphed into our engagement in the punch walk process. We had many communities where there were multiple buildings coming online in rapid succession. And as you can imagine, everyone is doing their best. And with the construction delays, there was an incentive for the contractor and the development team to keep the foot on the gas pedal, to get these things up and signed off and hand over those keys. That also leads to gaps and mistakes. In one case, we had an issue with windows and we got pushback from the general contractor. So the asset management team paid for a third-party forensics professional to go in and document the failure. That was what we needed to ensure that as the keys were being handed over, that deficiency was addressed. Those are the deficiencies that often don't show up in year 1. They're going to show up in year 8 or year 10. I'm going to pause there, but I could talk all day about this.
And I think too, like zooming out a bit, I know even less than Melissa, but it's still enough to be dangerous, in certain contexts. But I think this is a great opportunity to look at the organization and try to understand, do you have design standards? Are there things that you say, okay, for permanent supportive housing deals, we have to have floor drains. We have to have camera infrastructure there, whether there's cameras there or not, and we can set aside money at a later date to deal with that. But thinking about, are there both philosophical and very specific design standards that could be implemented to create a more streamlined process when you're bringing in teams like asset management? If you don't have the luxury of a facilities person or a CapEx person, which many people don't, like, where is the best point of feedback? And yeah, so, and this sounds ridiculous, but the amount of times that unit numbering doesn't make sense is wild to me. And so I just think that one needs more attention. It's wild. How do we go from like, we just know 101, it's just 120 off the bat. It just doesn't make any sense. And then the post service, don't get me started on the postal service.
Asset managers learn a ton about the best way to do all kinds of things, from unit numbering to flooring choices to whether to use cove base or wood trim in the bathroom, or which controlled access systems work the best for, the things that you absolutely must have in PSH units, like central drains. But it's nearly impossible to just recall all of those things in an ad hoc or even planned conversation with your development team during the design phase. So to your point, something that SEPA staff worked on, the development and asset management teams together, was a really robust set of construction and design standards. It's a highly detailed document that goes through every construction division and lists out all those pesky little things and includes their relative priority and VE options for more expensive items like central drains in bathrooms and hallways. And then that's something that can simply be handed over to the architectural team and doesn't then need to be reinvented every time you're going through design on a new project, because you're simply not going to remember all of the things that you've learned. And if you can build that up slowly over time, so many times I have come away from a conversation with property management, and then teams messaged my colleague in development and said, we need to have hard toilet seat lids in SRO shared bathrooms. I'm never going to remember that when they come back to me 2 years later and say, what's really important to have in PSH?
I think there's also like this first bullet is around like, is there a green roof? Like again, like we talked about, developers are getting funding sources from wherever they can. So there are certain sources that pay for certain fun, cool green features, like solar panels, for example. And one of my favorite stories, which is really sad that it's not my favorite, it's favorite example of what doesn't work without collaboration and communication, is a project that got solar panels on their roofs. I think it was 4 buildings. Project shall remain nameless. And lots of staff turnover, property management turnover, even turnover at the owner sponsor organization. And an inspector came out to look at the buildings and asked, well, so how is the solar impacting your energy bills? And everyone's like, what's solar? Nobody had any idea that there were solar panels on the roofs of these buildings. Like it was tall, it was designed in a certain way you couldn't really see. So that's just an example of like asset and property management not in the loop, not involved, didn't get training on how to maintain them, didn't even know they were there. So just it's a very extreme example, but just one that is actually like it did actually happen. Any other things on this one?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think design and finishes can feel to me like a little bit of a nebulous topic because it bridges into so many of the other phases that we've talked about: feasibility, OpEx, understanding like what kind of HVAC you have like available. Is it a PTAC unit? Is it a VRF system? Like how that interplays with your maintenance expenses. And it can get really nebulous, but I do think I don't want to ignore either the opportunity that resident services providers and property management can offer in the like unit design and common space finish like conversation, especially when it comes to talking more about and engaging more with trauma-informed design, especially if that is relevant for the populations you're serving. So understanding who needs to be in the room before decisions have to be made outside of just developer and asset manager is also a really important item to keep in mind.
Going even with a wider lens than trauma-informed design and just thinking about livability for residents and also marketability, not to sound like a broken record. Your construction and design standards that you all are going to go back to your offices and start working on soon can reflect your organization's mission and priorities in terms of creating great homes for your residents. So some design elements that we've talked about at SEPA are including at least 18 inches of counter space adjacent to the range so that residents have enough room to cook. So if you have your range shoved in between your wall and your refrigerator, it's just not going to be that much of a fun experience for you. So there are lots of ways to bring in small things that can make life a little bit better for your residents as well. And to KT's point about solar panels, I have a little bit of a less extreme example to advise some caution around building in significant cost savings from experimental or new designs or systems into your pro forma. At one property in SEPA's portfolio, there is a water catchment system that was originally intended to provide water for flushing toilets. And when I started at CPRA several years ago and took a look at the maintenance costs of the system and the water costs for the building, I had a sneaking suspicion that it wasn't functioning as intended. So we did a little experiment. We shut off the system. It was designed, the building would still go on to have water to flush the toilets because during the summer, the system wasn't intended to be full. So a few years on, there has been no difference in the water usage or costs other than what would be expected through typical utility rate increases at the building. I couldn't tell you exactly why the system isn't functioning as intended, only that it ultimately didn't result in any reduction of water use or cost for the building. Luckily, the building still cash flows, but that wasn't necessarily going to be the case. And just like any other affordable housing property, cash flow is declining. It's suffering from massively increasing operating expenses year over year. So again, that's just to advise caution in building those cost savings into your pro forma.
And also remember, like I said earlier, asset managers talk to each other. So we're going to hear stories like that in our asset management work group and be able to share if our organization is attempting the same thing, and we'll be able to weigh in. Okay, I didn't think it could get hotter in here, but it actually has gotten hotter. So I'm going to move us along. So we might be able to get out here a little bit early, but I want to leave plenty of time for everybody to open the floor and have questions answered. But this is my favorite section, so I'm going to have to keep my mouth shut because we have a panel to talk about this stuff, but my favorite section is coming up. Okay, last audience question. Is your asset management staff heavily involved in lease-up coordination with property management? Oh my God. I'm so terrified. Okay, we're going to talk about why that's really important. And we've got about 10 minutes. Hand it over.
I guess I'm starting us off. So we talked a little bit about this during the sort of feasibility underwriting OpEx discussion, but adequate staffing. CDP has done recently a lot of campus style deals. So lots of buildings coming online over an 8 to 16 month time period, also subject to construction delays like everybody else. When you're hiring staff positions is just as important as how many staff positions you're hiring to keep up with the leasing pace, as well as starting to manage folks that are there for a year until you finish lease up has become a really difficult nuance to address, especially with growing inflated expenses and the way that payroll has trended in the last few years, especially. But zooming out a little bit, like taking ideally in your pro forma, you have a lease up reserve, as we talked about. And so applying that forward into a projected budget is really critical before TCO comes, and reviewing that with management to make sure that not only do our fee structures align with management to perform the work and their go date, but also implementing staffing at the right time, understanding what our expense load is going to be when utilities are turning over, coordinating that closely with development. There's just so many moving pieces and parts. And so coordinating as closely as possible between development and asset management to really understand what time frame you're working under, to then build that plan backwards, ideally 6 to 8 months before TCO, and then be able to roll that forward seamlessly. And because we're in the world of a lot of subsidy layering in properties, multiple referral partners, lots of service agencies involved, also understanding what the partners need in order to be successful on site, either during extended lease up periods or just from the go, when their offices are finally finished and your FF&E theoretically gets delivered on time, which may or may not happen for office spaces. How can we ensure that they're also set up for success? Because it's not just about property management, as much as I would love for them to be empowered and able to hit the ground running day one. It's also about how is resident services going to be able to be successful when they're also interfacing sometimes with lease up as well as with folks that are living there at the same time.
And just building on that, this is also a great opportunity to revisit the rent analysis and ask the questions of, has the marketplace changed? Are the rents at the same place? Have they increased? And making sure that in advance of the lease up commencing, that there is coordination with both the asset management team and then also the property management team about where the rents are starting and why. We are seeing increasingly the need for concessions to meet the lease up targets and benchmarks. And so making sure that we're all very clear, because increasing those rents once a household is in place is extremely constrained. And so being mindful of that from an operational perspective is really critical.
Ideally, when your lease up is underway, developer and asset manager are working together to monitor credit delivery and thinking about whether rent concessions, deposit concessions are ultimately going to be less costly than a downward adjuster.
And lease up is, people think about it as like this very discrete point in time that can sometimes feel like it's happening in a vacuum, and it's not. And so thinking forward to, what are your perm loan target deadlines? What is a realistic schedule that you may or may not need to be revisiting with development on a regular basis based on actual lease up trajectory versus projected trajectory? And how do you also make sure, because a lot of what we're seeing in approaching conversions that are coming on the heels of lease ups, as they tend to be, especially with construction delays and high interest rates right now, on construction loan interest, is how can we make sure that both financials and stability are dialed in beforehand? Because collections are going to be a problem, especially if you have really long-winded lease ups. And how can we ensure that the teams working on the ground not only are focused on the lease up, but also on stabilizing the property at the same time? Because that is, a big amount to handle at once. And so thinking before you start leasing, what's a realistic perm target? And do we need to have a conversation monthly where we may need to shift around what our expectations are?
I feel like that bullet point is actually missing on here. And it's coming up more and more, is just reiterating what Mel said around understanding how the revenue and expenses are hitting the books, like during lease up. Like, how is property management categorizing everything? Where is it falling? What are some of them actually development costs that somehow got booked as operations? Like, that all impacts your property's ability to stabilize and convert. So it's not a small thing. And the amount of like magic that has to go into looking at financials every month for that stabilization period to get the numbers to work. It's pretty amazing, the acrobatics that are going on right now to make that happen. Any other things? Okay. Well, again, I could spend the whole hour and a half on this slide alone. But lots more to say, but here's the thing. You have access to this PowerPoint presentation through Housing Oregon's website. So just know that there's a lot of really rich stuff in these slides. This is a really good summary slide. It's sort of, and again, it obviously doesn't include everything, but it sort of breaks down asset management like tasks per phase. There's a lot more to add to that, but just know that this is kind of a good summary. And what I'd like to do now, if you need to like stand up so that you're not like stuck to your seat, might be too late. I'm going to open the floor and I'm going to walk around with the microphone, and our panel is going to address your questions or comments or both. Okay, here we go.
Be nice, Dave.
I have two questions. One on the slide that you previously had up there. You actually had input from the asset management side on the construction column. For the design teams, that's really challenging because one of the examples that you point out is the room numbers, and I know what Mel is referring to. And so what happens on our end, so I'm Dave Mojica with Scott Edwards Architecture, and on the design side, what happens with the room numbers is when we start programming, Typically from the project managers, they don't have all the programs dialed in. So what ends up happening is like, we know there's 16 units in a building, so we'll number those with a certain logic, but then we have these gaps because we don't know, are you gonna ask for 5 closets? Are you gonna ask for a storage unit? They always do in pre-design because they say, oh, asset management wants a storage. I have not seen the storage realized on any affordable housing project I've worked on in 5 years. What typically happens is asset management comes back in later in construction and we're walking the site as it's being built. And they're like, where is the storage? Like, where are we putting our attic stock? And the feedback that we typically get is, or what we have to say is, well, the PM told us to get rid of it because they couldn't afford it. So my first question is like, I think the question is a little bit twofold. One, I think we recognize and empathize with the fact that on the project management side, they're juggling a lot of things, and sometimes the asset management conversation doesn't loop back to the design team. And I actually think the working relationship that we've had directly with asset management, and that has been through like the working partnerships over time, like on the design end, that's actually been much more productive for us because we've actually been able to advocate for asset management directly as the design team versus always going through the project manager. Because sometimes the project managers are just so inundated with so many voices. So I think first, I'm just kind of curious, you all work with different developments. I think my first question is, do you agree that like a direct interface with the design team, is that helpful or is that disruptive to your organizations? The second thing is you mentioned that you all talk to each other, you're with different organizations. If you have a strong belief in, let's say, we'll take an example for like 30% AMI units, we all know that those units get a beating. And over the course of time, like if you all agree, like on an asset management standpoint, those should have higher durability finishes. Is that something that anybody has ever talked about? If it's an industry agreement, connecting with OHCS to see if it should be a regulatory, if it could be regulated a different way versus trying for everybody to do it.
Go ahead, guys.
I will now expertly address all of the questions that you've just answered. I think I'll start with your comments about the disconnects between developers and asset managers on construction and design standards being a challenge for you and your team, and make another plug for organizations developing their own set of construction and design standards in advance of getting to the design phase on any given project, so that you are not then stuck in the middle or being asked to change the design mid-construction. At SEPA, asset management and development sometimes disagree on those elements, and developers disagree with each other as well. So I'm in favor of just kind of getting all of the options out there and then going line by line and talking about the relative priority of each of those things. How important is it to say have bullnose corners as an element of your trauma-informed design to your organization, so that those questions are being addressed at the appropriate time, which is not in the middle of construction.
I'll tackle sort of a bit of the first and a bit of the second, which is, I think your point about relationship development and sort of breaking down those silos with teams that work consistently on deals sort of one over the next is where we start getting those efficiencies, and where that direct line of communication starts being a lot more effective from the operational desks all the way back to the design and engineering team. I also think, to your point about engaging with Oregon Housing, that this is an arena that we need to bring all resources into this discussion. So yes, the state agency, but also our various jurisdictions, also the private sector. Like we are in crisis mode, and it's not going away anytime soon.
Dave, I like the numbering, just to be clear, the projects that we're working on together. And I like my closet space. But to your first question, because I cannot top Melissa's answer to the second one, is I mean, I really appreciate being engaged in the design review process, whether that looks like just a meeting between myself and the development manager and resident services, or between like when a presentation is being put together initially during design review. I think that's a great time for us all to like get on the same page and connect, and also establish not just what are our design standards for this project, but what can we VE and what should we really make sure to not value engineer out. Because I think, especially these days with construction delays and also gaps in financing, VEing is the common practice these days. So to your first question, yes, I love being included, generally speaking, in all things.
Okay, other questions, comments? Oh, I want to put a plug in for session tomorrow on rent analysis, where my colleague Liz Winchester and some folks from OHCS are going to be talking about rents and the complexities around max rent versus market and how you evaluate that. So highly encourage you guys to go to that if that's, your bag.
So I'm Rachel Stein, and I work for Portland Housing Bureau on the production side. So full disclosure, I'm not an asset manager nor a developer. But I was just, you mentioned lease up reserves and incorporating kind of a feedback loop with property management into the various development stages or various pre-development stages and construction stage. But in Portland, at least, we hear there's a lot of kind of volatility in the property management market or the property manager market with affordable housing, particularly with PSH or other kinds of like high need housing. So we hear a lot of stories about property managers kind of pulling out of a contract at the last minute because they've decided as a company not to manage like PSH buildings or something of that nature. Or we also get a lot of feedback from developers that they've had issues with property management companies during the lease up process, and them, not applying criteria they're supposed to, or adding questions or criteria that they're not supposed to ask that create a higher barrier. And so all of this contributes to these longer lease up periods and ultimately cost everybody money. So I'm just wondering if you could talk a little more about some strategies for sort of how do you plan ahead for something you can't really plan for? And also when there are so few property management companies that work in affordable housing, at least in the Portland market, like how do you plan for that and plan around it and prepare for it? Like, is there how much lease up reserve do you need if you might have to get a whole new property manager, and like, just how do you plan for that in this environment?
That could be a whole session on its own. Short answer is money, but I'm sure these guys will have much more rich comments than that.
So you're absolutely right. As KT mentioned a few times, the property management environment right now is really constrained and very tumultuous. And so who you have in those offices, same thing with services, makes such a difference for how these communities lease up and function. So first is this is an arena where I think we need to be much more realistic about how much a strong, competent team is worth, and start underwriting higher staffing costs from the beginning. That does not address the gap in the availability of agents that are willing to work in the Portland metro area right now. That is a much broader discussion, but one strategy that I have seen has hope. I won't say it's effective yet, but it has hope, is talking to one another, sharing resources, and then also building a bench of management agent options so that when the management agent walks off, you have folks that you already have engaged with, that are already familiar with your portfolio, with your mission, that you can engage with, because the courtesy of a 6-month notice is a thing of the past.
I do want to say that there are efforts. I mean, it's a little discombobulated, but we're working on how to make that a little bit better and more streamlined. There are several different groups that are kind of getting together, and now we're going to start collaborating on trying to figure out how to solve the property management issue. Like, what is it? Is it the cost? Is it training? Is it just not being able to find people? Is it all of the above? What's the solution? So there is a work group that's starting to talk about the stuff. It's just going to take a while. But in the meantime, I feel like Melissa's comments were really important to take to heart. Any other things? Oh, sorry. Yeah, go ahead, Natalie. Sorry.
Some of that answer to that really challenging questions also going to depend on the organization, because to be quite honest, different organizations have very different portfolios, different financial strength backing them as an organization, different histories with property management companies, and not every organization is going to have the same level of access and choice when it comes to property management agents. So it's a hard question to answer on a broad level. There's also that PSH element that you mentioned, and the answer to your question as far as 100% PSH or largely PSH lease-ups are considered goes pretty far beyond property management to include the service partners on the deal, coordinated access, and JOS, and whatever organization, say Home Forward or OHCS, is funding the vouchers on those units. And it's a complicated ecosystem that makes those lease ups fairly challenging. And the solutions then need to involve all of those different organizations.
And please, 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 whatever you do, do not assume that self-management is the answer. Okay? Like, if you're wondering about that or questioning that, please come talk to us afterwards. Anybody else? Okay.
Thank you. Recognizing that workloads and capacity are not growing at the same rate. Asset management wants to be a part of a lot of these conversations, but on the realistic end of it, I don't think you want to be on the phone with me at 9:30 at night when I'm negotiating with my investor. So if you had to pick two major components that you really want to be a part of to see the portfolio succeed in the next 10 years, what would they be? Stop.
So thank you. It's a great, challenging question. I want it all. And so I'm going to start by saying there's a lot of this workflow that doesn't have to happen in real time. So figuring out how we share documents, how we share process, how we bring together a range of voices into this space without all sitting in a room, because the last thing that any of us want is another meeting. But I do think a good portion of this work can happen in an asynchronous fashion. There's going to be a time bound. And so it's going to be really important that we're all clear about the deadline as it relates to the development process. But yeah, I know that's not the answer you were looking for, but I want it all.
this is can get into a little bit of a tangent, so I'm going to be a little careful. But what I really appreciate is that every person that I work with on my team has really different skill sets. And so leveraging people's different skill sets and interests can help bridge that gap. So if somebody is really well versed in more of the construction design set review side that I am not, they might be the right person in the room to give feedback. How that looks when, the distribution of deals amongst people is very different. I think can obviously change, and going off of what Melissa said, like as much as you can do institutionally and process wise, the better off the projects are going to be from a capacity constraint side for asset management, because that is, as we said at the beginning, burnout and capacity constraints are a real issue. If I personally had to choose, because I have an answer for your question, I don't want to be on the phone with your investor at 9:30 either, but I would focus more based on what I am interested in my skill set on the financing side of the deal, the makeup of the OpEx, and really pushing the investor negotiations. That's a little bit more in my track.
To answer your question, because I'm about to also not really answer your question, I would echo what Mel said, because what that really comes down to is debt sizing. And over time, rents will increase, and what's not going to change, at least without a lot of effort and possibly additional capital funding, is your debt service. To take a little bit of a broader lens, I recognize that developers are very much in between a rock and a hard place, because on one hand, you have your asset manager telling you that your operating expenses per unit per year are not high enough, and you need to increase them, and you need to reduce the rents and somehow make that work, not just for the deal itself, but also within the various underwriting standards of various funders that you are subject to. So there really needs to be change on that institutional and regulatory level to meet developers where they are in 2024 and not hold you all to an outdated standard of $6,500 per unit per year in operating expenses, because it's just not realistic.
Yeah, and just another plug for our asset management work group. Like, we're doing a lot of that, like having a lot of those conversations and inviting funders to the table, and like having those conversations to sort of plant the seed. Stuff takes a really long time to change. But I feel like, I mean, I at least at the state level, I feel like they're hearing us. It's just, it's like turning the Titanic around, or whatever analogy you want to use. I think we're close to time, right? Count 3. We have maybe time for one more question. Was there anybody else who wanted to? Oh boy. Okay. Keeping people from leaving early.
Well, yeah, this was actually an answer to the last question. And I would continue to say operating expenses and design. I think those are the two things that will most impact an asset management manager's job reviewing the property day to day. And I would say, if you don't want to involve us in lease up, cool, you're on your own, have fun. We're happy to get involved, but that's fine. And I would also say with operating expenses, like, it doesn't need to be a long and involved conversation. I've definitely had some conversations with developers where we just look at the OpEx per unit and that's it. And I'm like, what range is it in? In terms of the actual categories, we'll figure it out later on, but let's just do a quick reality check of how does this compare with the rest of the portfolio?
Mm-hmm.
And is it good?
Just to make one more comment, Mel was talking about like teams and like playing to folks' strengths. HTC, someone on my team just did like a lease up project management. So like the sponsor organization, they had hired a developer. They had their own resident services and supportive services folks, but they didn't have asset management capacity. So we actually kind of stepped into that role to help manage the whole process from basically when marketing, a little bit after marketing started, and then all the way through stabilization and conversion. So like there are ways in which you can fill in the pieces from your teams that are kind of missing. So just wanted to name that. Anything else before we adjourn? Thanks for sticking around, you guys. It is unbelievably hot in here.